Welcome everyone. I'm just going to wait while participants are entering the event before we get started. Welcome to Creolizing the Nation, a discussion featuring Kris F. Sealey and Michael Monahan. Thank you for joining us. We are thrilled that you're here. My name is Ann Strother and I work in sales and marketing at Northwestern University Press. And I have a few brief notes to make before I introduce Kris and Mike. First, this event is being held in collaboration with the Southern Journal of Philosophy, the University of Memphis, and Fairfield University. And I wanted to take a moment to thank them for everything that they've done to support this event. The discussion is being recorded and an edited interview will be printed in the Southern Journal of Philosophy. We are also streaming the conversation live on our Facebook page. You'll be able to find the video there after the event has concluded. Kris's book, Creolizing the Nation, is available on our website at a 30% discount. Enter promo code Sealey, that's S as in Sam, E-A-L-E-Y, at checkout to redeem this offer. The promotion ends at the end of 2020, which is coming sooner than we suspect, so you'll want to order your copy sooner, not later. Our website is nupress.northwestern.edu. The conversation today will be followed by a Q&A. While you won't be able to access the Zoom chat box, you can submit a question through the Q&A feature along the bottom of your screen. Now, Kris F. Sealey is an associate professor of philosophy at Fairfield University and the author of Moments of Disruption, Levinas, Sartre, and the Question of Transcendence. Sealey's areas of research include critical philosophy of race, Caribbean philosophy, and post-colonial theory. Since 2011, she has served as the book review editor of the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy. She also directs philosophy in an Inclusive Key Summer Institute, a summer immersion experience at Penn State University for underrepresented undergraduate students with an interest in pursuing a doctorate in philosophy. Mike Monahan is the philosophy faculty, or is a part of the philosophy faculty at University of Memphis, where his teaching and research focus on race and racism, political philosophy, and phenomenology. He is a past vice president of the Caribbean Philosophical Association and author of the Creolizing subject, Race, Reason, and the Politics of Purity. Without further ado, Kris and Mike.
Since I'll be asking the opening questions, let me start by thanking Northwestern University Press and thanking Kris for this book and thanking Fairfield and my own department for helping to support this event. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And so without further ado, let's get that started. The book covers a lot of territory and touches on a lot of figures and themes. So everyone from Fanon and Glissant to Gloria Anzaldúa and Maria Lugones and Mariana Ortega. And so there's a great deal to try to pull together. So what I want to do is to begin by asking a couple of questions that are more or less invitations for you to sort of set the stage for the audience here that are not familiar with the entirety of the text yet. So in the first is a very basic question about how you're understanding Creolizing in this context, the work that it's doing, especially in the sense of your political project, that is, why you're advocating for Creolizing as a kind of prescriptive response to what you see as particular problems in the way we understand nationalism, national identity, and you saw how you're situating Creolizing as in a way, Creolizing the Nation as in a way a response to what you see as the shortcomings of post-nationalistic approaches.
Okay, thank you, Mike, for that question, and mostly for being here, and for being one of the midwives, if I can use that term, for this book and this project. Before I start answering your question, I just want to say thanks to you and to so many other dear intellectual comrades of mine whose work has influenced this book in really big ways. So folks like Jane Anna Gordon, Lewis Gordon. This book wouldn't be what it is right now if it wasn't for their friendship and their gracious intellectual gifts. So, and also to say thank you to the University of Memphis, Memphis Nation, Northwestern University Press, and my own academic home, Fairfield University, for making all this possible. What do I mean by creolizing? And in what sense is Creolizing the Nation a political project juxtaposed against or opposed to these more post-nationalist approaches? So maybe I'll start off sort of from the second and work my way up. As a political project, right? So this frame of creolization is, for me, allows us to foreground the kinds of politically salient work at the level of the everyday, right? So those quotidian acts, decisions, and gestures whose efficacy really is about disrupting, perhaps only in that moment of time, the habitus, if you will, of colonial and also white supremacist logic. So on this reading, Creolizing the Nation is really about asking us to be attentive to certain agencies from below, and that's the language that I use in the book. Agencies that are always coming up with new and more liberatory relationships to power, to domination, and really doing so in a way that shouldn't be possible. And that, I think, is always political in itself. So, for instance, the graffiti vandalizer is doing that. Jazz is doing that. The subterfuge of enslaved Africans on the plantation and in the work field did that. Even as those acts went unnoticed, in a kind of opaqueness, if you will, to dominant power as a kind of subterfuge. And so Creolizing the Nation, so to the question, what do I mean by creolizing? So Creolizing the Nation, in a sense, allows us to, one, recall the ways in which these marginalized communities have always dreamed in blasphemies, if you will. Those are the words from Micheline Critchlow's book that I use for this research. So it allows us to recall the ways these marginalized communities dream in blasphemies, to name that as a mode of liberation politics. And then two, Creolizing as a frame urges us to take that practice, right? That practice of dreaming in blasphemies into account as we think about not only possibilities for a future politics of liberation, but also our actual present political landscape as maybe already containing wombs, if you will, of that politics of liberation. And so maybe I'll share a conversation in response to this question. I'll share a conversation here that my husband, David, partner in crime, now holding down the fort with the kids. We had this conversation just last night, and I think it would be helpful here, right? So quite often in the discourse on creolization and in Glissant's work in particular, the metaphor of the mangrove appears. And the salience of this metaphor is because of its rhizomatic growth, right? So root growth that is across, right, zigzagging, spreading wide instead of deep. But what's also salient to the mangrove metaphor or to the mangrove is that they grow in swampy water, right? So fresh water into which the salt of the sea kind of bleeds. And so we could maybe articulate a politics of the mangrove, if you will. And in that politics of the mangrove, we'd say something like one, right? So firstly, there is the emergence and enactment of life out of what shouldn't be able to support life, right? So salt and brine. And then two, as the mangrove makes life happen out of this particular not conducive for life ground, that mangrove is also, and perhaps quite inadvertently, stopping erosion, right? It's affecting the landscape. It's making that landscape into something that must then reckon with that life-generating work of the mangrove, right? If that makes sense. And so Creolizing the Nation is a political project in this sense, right? So firstly, enacting life out of structural logics that shouldn't be able to support that life, right? Affirmations emerging out of negations. And then two, sort of inadvertently, affecting the actual landscape of those structural logics of the nation, and making it into something that must then reckon with the life inventing practices of creolization. So that's one. And then maybe a little bit about how this is, or how I see this in relationship to the more post-nationalistic position. So the frame of the nation, right, at least to my mind, allows us to keep at the center of our theorizing and investigations the legacies of colonial domination, right? So which groups of people were previously colonized, and then which groups of people did the actual colonizing. So, and I think losing that mapping risks pulling us into the kinds of dangers that you sniff in talk of post-racialism. So I really am mindful about the way I distance the project from that position in order to emphasize what the book is not, right? An ahistorical multiculturalism stripped of any theoretical tools needed to grapple with questions of power, resistance to that power, and survival alongside or perhaps despite that power. So. That was a lot. Maybe answering your question and some. You're still on mute, Mike.
Sorry about that. I wanted to pick up on the thread of history because it occurs so much in your text, and as I was rereading it, it kept hitting me again and again, and I was trying to kind of get clear on the work that it's doing for you. So when you position the Creolizing Nation as a way of preserving or conserving the concept of the nation, but one that you're characterizing as more sort of sensitive to history or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, how it is that you see it accomplishing that task, right? Why is it that the Creolizing the Nation responds better to history than the sort of post-national kind of project?
Yeah. So on my reading and understanding of the post-national project, right? So to go truly post is to really decentralize or lose the tools necessary to grapple with the legacies of power, the legacies upon which nations emerge as such, right, at this moment in time, right? So perhaps another way of saying that and throughout the book, I really sort of go out of my way to underscore this, that positionality actually matters, right? When it comes to thinking about power, how it affects our everyday lives, and these sort of ways in which marginalized communities practice or rehearse moments of freedom and liberation, right? And so that positionality is something that I want to keep very central to how I'm thinking about creolizing the nation. And so, the entire time, I'm working on this book, is this internal conversation sort of happening in my head, right? So the rhizomatic spread, that's central to creolizing discourses and to glissants. So rhizomatic spread that is still happening on an actual unique piece of ground, right? Borders as porous event horizons, and still unfolding in a particularly constituted set of power structures. Power structures that give particular stakes, if you will, to those event horizons, or what happens at those event horizons. Fluid negotiations with the past, yes, but that's ultimately grounded in that past, right? How that past is fragmented, right? In the particular Antillean history, that's the context for for this way of theorizing, how that past is fragmented, how it's lost, how its loss is a presence that's actually shaping these creolizing negotiations, right? And so it was really important for me in this book to not offer a reading of Creolization that strips it or rips it from that history of rupture and violence that, quite frankly, makes Creolization what it is, right? And so, you know, very much actually like your own work, right, from back in 2011, right, the Creolizing subject. I think very much like your own work, this book, it can be read as a critique of purity politics, but it's a critique of purity politics that's not then permission to act as though the politics of our purity games then magically has no bearing, right, on our present, right, because it does. And so, yeah, so it's in that sense that the project is trying to work through what perhaps is an aporia or a paradox between thinking about communities in general and nation communities in particular as already shifting and jostling under this kind of subterfuge and sabotage, but that's ultimately and always in conversation with particular histories of power and domination.
Okay. Okay. So there's a couple things I want to pick up on here, but I'm going to begin by quoting you if you don't mind.
Okay,
so
that'd be great.
on page 7, you say, quote, "To that end, my interests lie in detailing a creolizing ontology of nationness, out of which configurations of identity, community, borders, and belonging can take into account the dynamism and ambiguity of post-colonial situations, and thus can clear conceptual ground to think differently about difference and relationality," end quote. So it seems to me that this is linked in a bit to what you were just saying about sort of these histories. And remember, there's one point also in the intro where you say something, something along the lines of colonization matters. Right?
Yeah.
And that there's a problem in the sort of tendency to ignore that or disavow it.
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering how it is that you understand the relation between these post-colonial situations and this dynamism and ambiguity you're talking about. Because you have this focus on the post-colonial and the anti-colonial context, which makes a lot of sense. But do you think that the analysis you're giving is exclusive to that context, would have to be altered if it went out of that context? So how tied is it to that post-colonial context?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And also a question that was a constant grappling in the text, right? And so, right, so can one's comportment towards national life be creolizing in this way if this history of colonial rupture, violent drowning of one's history is indeed not your history, right? And so, you know, so I did think about this question, and I continue to think about this question even when the book's done, right? As I worked on the book, and often, you know, so in my past life, I guess was 11S. Maybe I'm still 11S. In my past life, I worked on 11S more essentially, and so in thinking about these sorts of questions, you know, I recall how the ways in which Levinas often negotiates his own philosophy, right? So a philosophy that, you know, is clearly grounded in the experience of Judaism, as Levinas offers this sort of this philosophy grounded in a particular singular history, as he offers it as something that could actually be more universally relevant to the world writ large. And so, you know, it's been a while since I've been neck deep in Levinas, so, you know, I'm going to be fuzzy here. But as I recall this tension in Levinas, it's always that, right? It's always this tension between how his account of transcendence and vulnerability is both grounded in a particular history and also relevant to something that sort of extends beyond that history. And so, not quite a perfect translation here for this context, but in a similar vein, I also want, for this book, I also want to hold on to the significance of historical grounding when it comes to creolizing practices of meaning making, of making space and place for oneself in the world in this particular way. And so, someone like John Trabinsky, our friend John Trabinsky's work might be helpful here in the sense of how his work remains quite faithful to Edward Glissant's own understanding of creolization as a uniquely Antillean phenomenon, right? As a uniquely Caribbean phenomenon. And perhaps more broadly, a phenomenon born out of Black diasporic negotiations of making a way out of no way, right? And so these post-colonial histories of total loss or rupture or drowning of history matters, is what I want to say, when it comes to how creolizing encounters with power actually invent ways of resisting, and more importantly, why they precisely must bring forth newness into the world in this way. And so, I talk about that, in the book, about the significance of this particular history, right? A history that means that you have to begin with fragments. And I think that kind of bricolage, if you will, is something that does inform your way of being in the world only as a post-colonial subject of the Black diaspora. Having said that, right, that doesn't mean, or I don't want to say that means, that creolization in this kind of singularity is unable to travel. And this is another borrowing from the scholar Micheline Critchlow from her work. It doesn't mean that creolization can't travel. It doesn't mean that creolization isn't relevant for actually understanding the making of modern subjects against this background of modern modes of governmentality. And so, but I still want to say that grounding in those particular histories of rupture really is key to the work that I'm identifying in the theory of creolization. So universally relevant in a way that transcends that history, and very unique to that singular history all at the same time.
Thank you. I mean, this is something that I've been wrestling with as well. And one thing that struck me reading through this, there's a later point in the introduction where you refer to the myth of homogeneity, right? And so you're sort of comparing these histories of creolization with the sort of, and especially in the context of nationhood, right? So you're characterizing the sort of Euro-modern nationalistic project as, in a way, the sort of erection of a myth of unity and oneness that is in some sense timeless, right? Is primordial in some sense.
Right.
And this is another really, I think, interesting point that I wish we had more time to talk about. But what struck me is that if, in that way, if it is the case that this sort of appeal to homogeneity and timelessness and this sort of, you're characterizing it as a kind of Platonic unity, is mythological, right? Then in fact, the dynamism and ambiguity is the reality that's being elided by that myth in a way, right? That seems to me part of what is the kind of universal insight there, right? That there's the kind of the history that you see very present in the Caribbean context is a sort of it makes it more difficult to avoid that reality, where a lot of our history is actually the disavowal of that reality.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Right. And so for communities that have to grapple with this kind of absence or loss, that postulation of that kind of myth, mythic past of oneness is just not an option. Right. There is this sort of unavoidable sensibility that informs world making or worlding in that context, that is about invention and beginning again, precisely as a consequence of that historical rupture. Yeah, so I would say yes, that is precisely what I mean, or what the project means.
Thank you. I think we have time maybe for one more question, and I want to and kind of pitch a question that invites you to talk more about Glissant, because I think certainly many of our audience members will have some familiarity with Glissant, but he's largely neglected within philosophy, tragically, and so this will be a way to perhaps introduce some folks to his work. And you again, I'm going to start with a quick quote, right? Because your appeal to Glissant is very provocative, and so I'm trying to see what are some of the implications here. And so here's on page 81. So this is later in the text. Okay. You say, quote, "Becoming is only truly becoming when it is the emergence of radical difference for Glissant. And for him, creolization in the context of the Caribbean offers us a means through which this sense of becoming might be theorized." And I'm wondering how much work radical is doing in radical difference there. So if you could kind of say a bit more about how Glissant, and I know that there are links both to Deleuze and in some ways to Levinas here. So how should we interpret that sort of this idea of the emergence of radical difference for Glissant?
Right. Yeah. So my reading of Glissant is that by this idea of radical difference, he's asking us to think in terms of detour, in terms of impossible repetition, in terms of impossible returns to past that are only present as fragments. So in other words, present only in their absence, right? So really it is all about this unavoidable historical context that is uniquely Antillean. And so radical difference in this sense, as a consequence of the kind of historical violence on the table, right? The Middle Passage, plantation economies, that Middle Passage supported or perhaps still supports, right? And so the radical, right, the qualification radical in this idea of radical difference for Glissant on my reading, is meant to capture the kind of newness that emerges in creolizing practices, right? New relationships to power, new adaptations of past fragments in the present, for the sake of possible futures of freedom or liberation. And so, and all that newness, newness that one cannot explain or account for within the purview of the dominant totality in question. And so the idea of detour, as one reads it in Glissant, is used to explain how anything other than abjectness, other than life as social death even, right? To maybe dip our feet into Afro-pessimism a little bit here. How anything other than that abjectness even gets to be possible, right? Against a historical context like the Middle Passage, right? So how does humanity begin, or maybe begin again, right? To go back to our friend John Trubinsky's work, how he frames it. How does humanity begin again out of that kind of radical rupture? How do human communities detour out of this total coding of loss to produce the kind of vitality of which something like the Black diaspora is comprised? And so by radical difference, I want to convey what I think Glissant intends to convey, an actual invention of humanity, humanity as resistance, humanity as practicing freedom, or maybe as practicing abolition, as making place for itself where or when there shouldn't be any, that is quite really different from, right? So that's the radicalness of it. That is really quite different from what is determined by the kind of totalizing violence of New World context and anti-Black violence, right? So radical in that sense, if that makes sense.
Yes, no, that's helpful. I mean, what was sort of motivating the question, and I'll try to be really quick here because I want to save time for Q&A. What was motivating the question in a sense was that I was, there's a way of reading radicality that at least has the potential to appeal to a kind of purity, right? Like the pure as absolutely, like the different is absolutely different, purely different, in no way connected to the same. And that seems not to be what you're accounting for here necessarily.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's why, at some point, in my meandering as a scholar, and again, this is very much in conversation with folks like John Trabinsky or his work, I began to find someone like Levinas not as productive in ways that someone like Lisan is, right? There needs to be a way to say that this radical sense of rupture is at the same time in relationship or in conversation with the history of here and now. And Lisan does that for me. And I think for that reason, he is really quite pivotal for having to grapple with these kinds of questions.
Okay, thank you very much. There's so much more I would like to talk with you about, and hopefully sometime we'll have that opportunity again.
Go so fast. I feel like
it does.
It's
but I would like to open the floor to questions. So to use the Q&A function if you have them. Our U of Memphis grad student Jasper St. Bernard has already put in a question that can, I think, relatively quickly be answered, because he asks if you could give the name of the author that talks about dreaming and blasphemies again.
Oh, so shoot, do I have the book? Actually, I'm surrounded by so many books, y'all. I don't know if you can see, right? So no, it's inverted. Okay, so
no, it's not inverted to us.
Okay, yeah. So it's Micheline, I think it's how you pronounce the first name, Critchlow, and the name of the text is Globalization and the Post-Creole Imagination. Incredibly rich text. So I would recommend it without hesitation. Glad I had that right next to me.
Yeah. Do we have other questions?
That's it. I was so clear. It's amazing.
That's right. Oh, here we go. One. I've noticed that you make extensive and good use of metaphor in your work, for instance, the mangrove in today's talk. And I was wondering the role of this metaphor in your work in general.
The work
that was from an anonymous attendee. Yeah. So the role of metaphor in your work.
Okay. That's actually a really good question. So I think as very generally speaking, if I could describe, in broad strokes, the kind of work that I'm interested in, it's a sort of these speculative projects of coming up with ways of thinking about the world, ways of thinking about iterations of humanity that we have no evidence for in the here and now that is possible, right? So very often the very language that one needs to dabble in that kind of speculative enterprise, the non-metaphorical language, if you will, tends to feel restrictive, right? So the speculative nature of what it means to just sort of invent what would a world void of anti-Blackness look like, for instance, right? That kind of gets you to the outer limits of language as it is available. And I think it's in that sense that that all scholars, I think, who do this kind of work find metaphor as productive, right? It's a way to say things that language doesn't yet allow us to say.
Thanks. We've got a few more questions come in. The first one is from our friend Storm Heater. Hi, Storm.
Hi, Storm.
But he asks this very provocative question. So, and it picks up on some of what we were talking about before in terms of the sort of universal applicability of what you're doing. What is your prognosis for the U.S. nation state with respect to the sort of Creolizing project?
Yeah, so.
Just an easy one. Yeah.
Oh,
no
Storm.
minefields to step in either. Yeah.
Yeah. No, let's forget the minefields. Who cares? So, right. So, I mean, to be honest, that question, that sort of question, or the energy of that question was with me the whole time working through this book, right? And I kind of try to say some of what that was like in the introduction of the book and, you know, towards the conclusion, right? Like, you know, where, I mean, what does it mean to, what does it mean to advocate or to imagine or to speculate about a notion of U.S. nationists in general, but in particular U.S. nationists that actually supports liberatory conceptions of human life, right? And you know, often I tell my husband, like, you know, it feels sometimes like we just broke America. It's just, we just broke it, and it's just, we had it and we, you know, it's now broken. But I think that that sort of prognosis, that sort of diagnosis too quickly misses the kind of jostling that we could identify even in this U.S. context. That I think could qualify as these kinds of Creolizing practices, right? The ways in which marginalized communities, communities of color, Black folks, Indigenous folks, queer folks, you know, they're always already refusing to accept that this kind of U.S. national assessment of what it means to be human has the last word. And so I think so long as within our spaces, in the margins, in the linemen, as long as within our spaces, there are folks like these who say we refuse to not be human. We continue to demand place and I wouldn't say recognition, because I think that's like super fraud for, you know, maybe a different Zoom session we could talk about, but sort of demand despite what feels like a lost battle. I think so long as those things continue to exist, those are the forces that I think would save the U.S. nation state from the worst iteration of itself.
I was watching a panel last night on anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism that was excellent. But one of the comments that Lewis Gordon made in that was that there's a way to read Black Lives Matter as a movement for genuine democracy, or for something like a more humanistic democracy in the U.S. And that seems to sort of, to me, be sympathetic to what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and so, I mean, and that's always been the case, right? So, you know, I think the best versions of the United States, the best versions of democracy, right, that we find in the history of the United States have been precisely as a consequence of these sorts of movements, right? Demands by Black folks, demands by Indigenous folks, demands by, right? So because they're the ones that force a country like this to be better, right? To offer a better version of democracy. You know, Brittany Cooper the other day, when we lost Chadwick Boseman, was on TV and said something sort of along these lines, that you know, Black folks have been fighting for this thing called the United States of America since they've been Black folks. And there's something to be said about that.
Yeah, and I was thinking too, this fits in with the discussion of history as well. I was thinking about the recent White House memo on Columbus Day, right? That this history of resistance to that homogenizing narrative is itself part of the disavowal project of jingoistic nationalism within the US, right? It's a retelling,
Precisely.
it's a mythologization.
Yeah, yeah. I think if it wasn't for statues falling around us left, right, and center, right? I mean, true, that's mere symbolism. It's not gonna like, right, and that we need more than that. But the fact that these statues have been falling into rivers and lakes or what have you, that was precisely the impetus for that kind of statement, which is to say some things are happening, some things are shaking. It doesn't feel great to be in it, but
So let's switch gears a little bit and get a more technical sort of question.
okay.
Tom Marr has written a question that says, in the book, you suggest that the notion of the general will is inextricably tied to the idea of the metaphysics of the one, as explored by Ricardo Sanin Restrepo. And Tom is curious, in light of your exploration of Fanon in the final chapter, if you reject Jane Gordon's reading of Rousseau and Fanon as being bedfellows on this point.
Yeah.
So is there a way to conceive of Rousseauian, if only weakly, sense of general will as concordant with the Glissantian notion of radical difference?
Right. That's a good question. I appreciate the opportunity to respond to it, because I do actually very much I'm influenced by Jane Anna Gordon's creolization of Rousseau via Fanon, right? And so, I mean, I wish I could go back and remind myself of where exactly I said that. But I think there's outside of or prior to that creolizing reading of the general will, it is possible to adopt the general will for such purposes, right? As a tool of homogenizing, right? Which is precisely how and why the work that Jane Anna Gordon is doing, I think, is saying that this is just perhaps one quite agendered reading of the general will. So the short answer to that question is absolutely. I am on the same side of Jane Anna Gordon's the way she's taking up Rousseau's general will, but I think she's offering that she does that project in response to other ways of reading the general will that don't necessarily get us to what Fanon wants to get us to.
Thanks. I'm sort of curating here, but I'm doing it rather on the fly. So I may be missing some really great ones. So but I've got quite a few up here now. So here's the one that I've hit on for next. This is from Shay, and I'm sort of summarizing here. Shay invites you to give a sort of what they call a super general nod toward how this might be used in tandem with indigenous philosophy. So this is something I know I've faced also with the sort of way we're sort of framing creolizing. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say about this.
Yes. So thank you for that question, Shay. And this was a question that in talking to various folks about this project, back when we had a world where you could actually go to folks and have conversations about things, this question did come up, and I am ever so grateful to such questions, because the way in which the book ends is actually to problematize creolization precisely through this frame of indigeneity, right? I don't know if I'm allowed to do a book reading, so I won't open the book. But so where I am right now actually is sort of just beginning to think about perhaps what might also be a book project. I don't know, but to think about this juxtaposition of creolization and indigeneity. I don't know if anyone from Fordham is on the call right now, but I actually just this past Tuesday workshopped a paper with some graduate students at Fordham, and the paper was on this question of creolization or blackness, migratory blackness as creolization, alongside the question of indigeneity. And so in the conclusion of the book, I turn to Jody Bird's work, her book, The Transit of Empire. And in that book, she offers us a conception of horizontal cacophony. And I'm trying to begin with that notion of horizontal cacophony to think through the ways in which when presented with this demand to be accountable to the indigenous question or to the indigenous demand for land repatriation, the ways in which Creolization, very much in the spirit of Creolization, is forced to move beyond itself into something else, right? And so in the conclusion of the book, in order to do that, I suggest that it's maybe more productive to think about Creolization not as a fait accompli, but as an imperative. And via that imperative to Creolization, faced with this indigenous demand or the position of indigeneity, is forced to go elsewhere. But that is precisely what Creolization is supposed to do. So that's kind of where I am right now. And it's very much an unresolved question, but I do precisely acknowledge that it is the next question for me.
I think, I mean, as I mentioned, this is something I've been sort of wrestling with as well. And your discussion, actually, I thought of Lugones and curdling was particularly fruitful here, because I mean, it seems like the moves you're making there is to say there's a sort of way in which borders, right? That the telos here is not the sort of elimination of all borders, but that in fact, sort of keeping notions of distinction and boundary and difference is in fact an integral part of the Creolizing project.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think at least how I'm seeing it, you know, Lugones's conception of complex communication, sort of polymorphic communication, you know, alongside this concept, this way of thinking about boundaries or borders as curdling, is very much within the same frame of Bird's cacophonous negotiations. And so it's all very messy right now, but yeah, but that question was percolating throughout the entire project.
Here's another question. This one's going back to Levinas. So this is from Jasmine Wallace.
Okay, hi Jasmine.
Yeah, lots of familiar names here. So Jasmine writes, as someone who is currently making use of Levinasian philosophy to analyze contemporary anti-Black violence, I wonder if you could say more about the limits of applying Levinas philosophy to other historical contexts than the one he's specifically concerned with. What do you think of, for example, how decolonial theorists, for example, Maldonado Torres and Dussel, extend the concept of the Levinasian other to the global South?
So, I mean, I do appreciate the ways in which Dussel and Nelson use Levinas. And actually, there was an article that I wrote that got published back in 2015 for a special issue that our mutual friend Doug Fajek was putting together. Doug's in the call. Hi, Doug. That tried to bring together Levinas and Fanon on the question of an ethical politics. And so I'll try to be both brief and clear. I think that the tools we find in Levinas allows us or gives us ways to articulate just that, right? The possibility of a politics that is also ethical, the possibilities of a politics that's always sort of on its toes or about to be disrupted by its otherwise or by its beyond. And I think those sorts of moves are productive when trying to think about how projects like this settler white supremacist state can move into something else, right? So Levinas is productive in that sense. one of the reasons I found myself moving away from Levinas, and it could be that my reading of Levinas is too truncated, but to me, for Levinas, the position of, or the role of alterity or otherness, or the other in Levinas, is to capture or convey this sense of radical vulnerability, right? And there's some sort of power in that vulnerability, but it's a radical vulnerability itself, right? What I'm interested in, or what I ultimately became interested in, that led to a project like this, Creolizing the Nation, is to think about these moments of alterity, if you will, these moments of disruption, if you will, not in their radical vulnerability, but as possessing a kind of agency that is very explicitly political. And I think when you try to push Levinas to do that kind of work, things kind of get wonky. And so that I think, as far as my reading goes, that is what I think would be my how I see Levinas as limiting in doing this kind of work. Being able to articulate, the ways in which the face of the other is both historically grounded, right? Not like actual Black, and has actual, specifically colored eyes. So that's a common critique of him. But what kind of political agency you find in that face?
Jesus Luzardo has a question. They write, in relation to the potential universality or universal application of creolization, what is the relationship between creolization and geography? I'm here thinking about Glissant's analysis of the Caribbean's diffracted geography.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Glissant has an interesting response to a question like this, right? So for Glissant, he thinks about the geography of the Caribbean as both very particular and placed in a very particular, unique way. But at the same time, a geography, precisely because it is where it is also an opening out onto a more globalized kind of context, right? And I think this is because the Caribbean, the history, or how that history fits into the story of modernity. There is no modernity, there is no capitalism, right? Without the stuff that happened in the Caribbean islands, right? In that particular specific geographical region of the globe, right? And so Glissant would say that it's both particular and universal in that sense, right? And interestingly enough, this is why, like the way Glissant fits into other Caribbean thinkers and writers tends to be kind of fraught, right? Because often the critique of this kind of move in his work is to say that, well, you're giving up everything that is unique and particular about the Caribbean, right? You're saying that the Caribbean is ultimately a door or a mirror or some sort of vestibule to to everywhere else, or to the elsewhere. But I think that's to collapse the tension, in a way that's too hasty. So I don't know if I answered that question, but that diffracting does that kind of work for someone like Glissant. And so maybe that's the sense in which creolization can travel, right? In a way that's also grounded in a particular history.
Here's a marked change of tack here. An anonymous question. Who do you envision as the audience for this text, and how do you imagine it might be mobilized for change making?
Yeah. So I envision everybody as the audience of this text. So, right. So what's my trade? By trade, I'm an academic, right? And so I I write this text as an academic. I write this text in a way that, in a language that academics tend to use. But, you know, I'm also an academic that's very much has a home in a classroom. So I'm a teacher as well. So, you know, I write this text for young folks, graduate students, undergraduate students, who are, you know, who want to take up this kind of speculative work, and who want to find the resources to imagine a possible different world, right? And I offer Creolization as a conceptual frame that allows them to tinker with language to do precisely that. So I think I'm writing it for students who want to learn in this kind of way. And by students, I mean that in the broad sense, not necessarily the butts that are in the seats in my classroom, right? Anyone who wants to take up this work to learn what does it mean to imagine and otherwise. So was there a second part to that question that I lost track of?
No, I think that covered it.
Okay. Okay.
I think hopefully the person, if it did not satisfy the person, they can
They'll come back.
again. Yeah. I'm going to synthesize a couple of questions here because Yannick Team asked a very general question about how you use. Yeah, very exciting. Asked a question about how you use Latina feminists in your text, and Miguel Guarron has a specific question about Anzaldúa. So that'll give you a way to, in a sense, answer both of them by answering Miguel's question.
Okay.
So Miguel says he was wondering if you can say something about the relationship between creolizing, in particular glissant, and mestiza, mestizaje in the work of Anzaldúa. Are they compatible notions? How do you approach them in the book? That's the question.
Okay. So yeah, so firstly, I wanted to bring these two groups of scholars and scholarship together because I found it super surprising. So, you know, I mean, I think this is the case for many of us, if not all of us, that, you know, we happen to end up reading certain things for various reasons. And at some point in time, you know, two texts or two sets of texts end up on our desk, as it were. And then you're like, and, you know, these connections start, or questions start coming up just for the arbitrary reason that these are the two texts or groups of texts that happen to be on the desk at that particular point in time, right? I wish I had a more interesting story as to how I came to thinking, well, wait a minute, why isn't there scholarship that's bringing these two bodies of work together, right? And by bodies of work, I mean Caribbean scholarship, specifically focused on questions of creolization and Latina feminist scholarship. To my mind, there's sort of little to nothing there. And I saw the book, or the book at some point became an opportunity to bring those two together, right? So that's kind of the backstory of how the second part of the book became what it was. But more specifically to the question about Anzaldúa, and the position of the positionality of the mestiza, I explicitly bring that into conversation with glissant, or with the kind of creolizing subject that I think would emerge from glissant's conceptual frame. And I say that in an important sense, so I establish differences, right? So glissant is trying to work in a historical context where creolizing communities or creolizing subjects find themselves in a particular place where return to some homeland is impossible, and some modulation of becoming indigenized to that place is unavoidable, right? Where you sort of have to make home where you find yourself, right? For scholars like Anzaldúa, and I think Lugones and Mariana Ortega is in this category, they I think are trying to work out notions of subjectivity and community formation that's more grounded in more recent experiences of migrations, right? Where, you know, memory of home and homeland is perhaps not necessarily retrievable, but not completely lost in the way it is in the Creolizing context. And so I make sure to lay out that historical difference. But alongside that historical difference, I do talk about the ways in which the mestiza subject or mestiza consciousness is really interested in or is functioning with conceptions of border and fluidity and movement that is quite akin to the kind of Creolizing subject that you would imagine glissants were giving to us. And I do a similar thing with Lugones and Mariana Ortega as well. So anything more, I'll have to go into the book. And I don't want to do that because it's not a reading.
Let's see. Okay, here's a question relayed to us by Corey McCall from Emma Velez. Will you say a little bit more about how you see the role of the state in your account? Is there a tension between your account with decolonial feminist critiques of the state?
A tension in my accounts. I'm not sure how to hear that language of tension. But maybe I'll say, go ahead.
Well, I'm wondering if part of it is an invitation to spell out how you're seeing the relationship between the nation, especially a Creolizing nation, and the state as a sort of institutional construct.
Yeah. So I think I see this somewhere in the introduction. In the first parts of the book, where you know it's pretty important for readers to think about the project as a Creolization of the nation and not a nationalization of Creolization, right? And in that juxtaposition, what I'm trying to do is really keep separate two ways of thinking about the nation, right? So the nation as a nation state, which has to do with its sort of bureaucratic operations, its modes of governmentality, structures of jurisprudence and economic sovereignty and so on and so forth, right, on the one side. And then alongside that, very much in relationship to that more state-like iteration of the nation, is this sort of everyday on the ground culture of the nation, right? And it's on that side of nationness that I think, that I want to say Creolization has something interesting to say about how we should understand that culture in relationship to perhaps the state's mechanisms of insisting on homogeneity and stasis and returns to mythic past, right? So it's on the sort of cultural comportment of nationness that the work in the book is located. So I don't know if that entirely answers the second half of the question, but.
Well, I see here that Corey posted that Emma continues, is the idea of the state something that we can retain, given the demands of decolonization?
Yeah, maybe not. Insofar as, at least it's in its current instantiation, right? The state very much continues to deploy certain conceptions of management of bodies, land as property, allocation of resources in a way that, you know, supports the mechanism of colonialism. I don't know what it would mean to think about the state without those sort of tools and mechanisms. And so my sort of off the cuff answer to that question is probably not. But yeah, I have to think about that some more. Was that a question you said?
That was, yeah. So the question got posted in two parts. The second part of which I missed the first answer.
Appreciate it.
Here's an anonymous attendee asks if you can say a bit more about how you came to start working on the book and how it might relate to future projects.
Okay. So interesting story there. So I came to this question that first just started off as a question, and then it became a question that just wouldn't go away. And then I'm like, shit, I need to start reading some things to help me make sense of this question. And then it became a book. So I myself, I'm a migrant to the United States, right? So I'm a permanent resident as of now. And so, you know, a couple years ago, it began to make sense for me to think about what it would mean to take up U.S. citizenship. And so this question of, well, what does it mean to name yourself in that way, right, as a citizen of a particular national project? What does it mean to think about oneself as a national subject generally? I sort of felt the need to sort out those questions, but it was very much prompted by, well, maybe I should think about becoming naturalized. I've been here long enough. Don't think I'll be returning to Trinidad anytime soon. So that's kind of how I came to the project, through that question. And then what was the second? What's my future projects? What was that? That was the second.
How the book relates to future projects.
Yeah. So as I think this was in response to Shay's question, right? The question about the relationship between creolization and indigeneity. That's the future project, right? And so, you know, what does it mean? So I originally hail from Trinidad, and Trinidad's history is such that there was, theft and transplantation of Africans so that they could become slaves. And then when that was no longer the case, right, there was voluntary, right, migration of South Asians, right, under the rubrics of indentureship, right? And so in order for any of that to happen, for this sort of migration and transplantation of different sorts of bodies from one part of the globe into the next, there needed to be this project of clearing away, right? Clearing away land to make space for these sorts of colonial enterprises. And so I'm very much a product of that clearing away. And so now I need to make more sense of that. What does it mean to think about these two arms of colonial violence at the same time? And what does it mean for the legacies of those two arms of colonial violence, those communities, to be accountable to each other in a way that really gets us to something like a decolonial imaginary. So that's my next project. And it's very much a consequence of how this particular project ended. It ended with a question.
Next question that I see, I think builds on this in a way. Nels Pearson asks, is the salience of the nation form due in part to the ways in which it can still provide rights and identity, as well as that it is a site of power and historical issues that need to be resolved relative to that form? And that these are better achieved if the nation is creolized, as opposed to the potentially privileged post-national idea that the nation should be irrelevant. Does this intersect at all with Homi Bhabha's vernacular cosmopolitanism or ideas of minority cosmopolitanism, or is the cosmopolitan hopelessly wedded to the post-national? Does a creolized nation change our sense of what the international is? That's the question.
That's the question. Good question. Thank you very much, my friend Nels, for that question. So I think it does. You know, towards the end of the book, where and throughout the, you know, I use Homi Bhabha's work in the book. I use the work of Paul Gilroy, right? His conception of a planetary humanism, which is sort of related to cosmopolitanism, but not quite. But towards the end of the book, I'm pretty clear about how I want to set aside this project of creolizing conception of nationists from a kind of internationalism or from a kind of cosmopolitanism. And the reason for that is to go back to, you know, some of the things that we were talking about earlier on, Mike, is to say that I think that too much runs the risk of ripping out or tearing away or uprooting these nationally constituted communities out of the historical context of colonial conquest, right? And so, you know, I don't, the project is not so much interested in, well, you know, where will this get to? Maybe at some point we'll get to a sort of post-colonial or cosmopolitan kind of arrangement of human life. I mean, those are interesting questions, but I think if a project like this grapples with such questions too soon, right, we run the risk of the kind of ahistoricity that I precisely want to avoid, because then we're not talking about creolization anymore.
Okay. Let's see. So here's a question from Reese Faust.
Hi, Reese.
He's asking about if you could explain a bit more how the creolized notion of a national community can resist a kind of nostalgic reassertion of a mythic or primordial unity.
Yeah. Good question. So, you know, there are, coming out of the Caribbean, there are Caribbean scholars that lay this critique against discourses of creolization, right? And the critique is that it's a critique that comes not solely or primarily, but maybe a lot from scholars from the Caribbean who approaching the Caribbean question of identity from an East Indian diasporic perspective. And the critique is that, well, in the Caribbean context, this language of creolization gets adopted precisely for these sorts of programs, right? It gets adopted to not only generate a mythical pastness and source of origin that ends up excluding certain communities that are themselves Caribbean, but it gets adopted in a way that actually reproduces the kind of racialized hierarchy, right? That reproduces the kind of anti-Blackness that, you know, my claim is creolization is in response to. So that impetus is there. And so in response to your question, Reese, I would maybe borrow Jane Anna Gordon's words from her book on Rousseau and Fanon, when she says something to the effect of when that's the iteration of creolization that we're faced with, then it's no longer creolization in any real sense, right? It's sort of, well, this is not Jean's word, these are my words, it's sort of a creolization in drag, if you will, right? Pretending to be a thing that it's no longer.
Yeah, there's a very similar history or set of histories with respect to mestizaje in Latin America and the Spanish Caribbean, right? Especially with respect to the anti-Blackness that's sort of built into it. I do think it's really important to see the ways in which the Creolizing and Creolized communities or can begin to adopt a politics of purity with respect to their own sort of status, right? That it becomes in its own way a kind of the pure category of the mixed.
Exactly. Yeah. I think you know, now that you frame it in those words, I mean that's precisely right. So this is the kind of critique that Cristina Beltran, for instance, has of the new mestizo, mestizaje, right? The idea that, well, to be hybrid is the new, right? You have to be purely impure, right? Purely hybrid, because nothing else will do.
Ashley Morales has a question about jostling. She asked whether you could maybe elaborate on small and large examples of how you're using jostling and especially how you imagine it as being productive.
Okay, good question. Hi, Ashley. Ashley was one of my Pixie students. I'm very happy to see Ashley here. Right, so I try to flesh out this metaphor a little bit in the book, right? And so, you know, kind of quite literally, when you think about a structure that's being jostled, right? Like a stack of cards or a stack of books or, you know, a stack of dinnerware or something, right? So it's being jostled by some particular presence or force. And as jostled, it's not completely toppled to nothingness, right? So it still stands, but the how of it standing, right? It's standing in a way that precisely has to take into account this sort of outside force, right? And it's in having to take into account this outside force that this outside jostling force is a kind of constitutive outside, right? And so as an abstract theoretical frame, that's kind of how I'm thinking about jostling. But I think Ashley was asking about like specific examples of jostling. So I mean, I mentioned, I think in our earlier conversations, Mike, you know, the graffiti artist, for instance, right? So you know, making a presence in the community in a way that doesn't completely topple the power structures or topple, you know, the governmentality of management and control. But it's a gadfly, right? It's a presence that makes itself felt, and then in response to the graffiti, you know, resources has to be spent perhaps in like making the surfaces clean again, and then they come back again, and so it's a messing with power structures that doesn't quite topple those power structures. But in that messing with, I think there's a really interesting and productive and crucial politics of resistance that needs to be named as such.
I've got a few more minutes left, so let me see if we can dig into some more questions. So Morgan Elbut asks, could you expand on the notion of fragments in relation to creolizing practices, or what you described as beginning with and in fragments?
Mm-hmm.
He's referring early, I think you mentioned that early on. And she goes on, might there be processes of defragmentation or refragmentation involved? Are these fragments determined in relation to what might be thought of as an unfragmented history?
Are these fragments? So to the last piece of that question, I think yes, right? So the ways in which Glissant or someone like Glissant wants us to think about Antillean history in terms of these fragments is definitely to be juxtaposed alongside a more uninterrupted kind of history, right? And so quite literally by fragments, Glissant is referencing the ways in which, or referencing what it meant for, you know, for communities, stolen Africans, right? Communities consisting of stolen Africans ended up on the plantation on Caribbean islands in a way that was in a way on the grounds of a violent tearing away from their history, right? And so you know, breaking apart of families, you know, actual laws that prevented enslaved Africans from coming together and rehearsing certain religious practices or spiritual practices, right? And so it's not to say that these forms of violences and rupture completely made this history go away. They were retained in fragments, right? And so, you know, what maybe most immediately comes to mind is the religious practice of Voodoo, or perhaps Santeria, right? The ways in which having only fragments, right? What was needed was a piecing together or a gluing together of bits of history that was a result of this violent rupture, right? And so many of the cultural forms in the Caribbean context, and I think you could include a place like Louisiana in this context too. Many of the cultural forms, the culinary practices, linguistic practices, right? That's definitely a big one. Are really about piecing together these fragments of history, precisely because they don't remain whole, right, on the other side of colonial conquest and violence. This kind of reminds me of the conversation I was having with the artist who graced us with the cover of my book, Natalie Del Villar. Definitely look her up, she's amazing. But this is kind of what I was trying to convey, and I think she captured it quite perfectly, by the fragmented nature of Caribbean history, right? A fragmentation that both generates beauty and life, but is still ultimately riddled with loss and pain.
I think this is a related question, and it's Jasper St. Bernard again, who asks if you could say a bit more on history and its relationship to myth, that is, the stories we tell ourselves, particularly about this particular nation. How does Creolizing impact myth making, and how do myths affect the Creolizing project?
So I think there are different kinds of myths, and different kinds of myths have different perform different functions for us. And so, you know, in one sense, and you see this really characterizing much of Caribbean literary work. I'm not a literary scholar, but you know, I have friends who are, and they talk about this precisely because, or insofar as Creolization is really about these practices of invention and beginning again out of sort of broken stories, you know, of fragments of history. There is a kind of myth making, right, that you find sort of driving Creolizing processes, right? But it's a myth making that's not for it's a myth making that doesn't close off the movement and fluidity of what it means to live as a Creolizing community, right? It's a making of myth because that's kind of what you have to do, right? You have to invent and reinvent in order to respond to this loss, right? So there's myth making in that sense, and then I think there's the other kind of myth making, which is, you know, the myth making that, for instance, the myth making upon which something like a settler futurity rests, right? This nation was discovered by said Christopher Columbus, and in being discovered, there was like no there, no one here. And by the way, there were people here, but they died anyway, but they weren't really people. And so it's a myth making precisely for the purpose of disavowing the kind of settler violence upon which the U.S. project must rest, right? And it's a disavowal that the project is very much invested in, because if it wasn't, then it kind of entirely falls apart. So I think not all myth making is the same, and they can perform very different functions for us.
Thank you. It's pretty much 4:30. Did you want to take a question or two more, or do we want to wrap up?
How do you feel?
Well, typical with my Zoom experiences, more exhausted than I feel like I should, but yet it's very, I mean, there's still some good questions here.
I mean, maybe we could take one or two more questions.
Okay.
Like easy questions.
Oh, easy questions, right? I've been saving those.
Yeah, definitely easy ones.
So this, I think, picks up on a theme that we've been talking about before. It's an anonymous question. To what extent does Creolization and Glissant's thought throw out an implicit challenge to the idea of the nation itself? Obviously, this also takes up Glissant's engagement with the changing status of Martinique and its relationship to France. But it really speaks to his ambition for the tout monde, beyond nation.
Yeah. Yes. And I recognize that that is a position in Glissant. And I recognize that that makes it kind of strange for a project like this to use Glissant to say that nationists can be Creolized or Creolizing in this sense. And the way that I try to navigate that in the book is to really try to articulate an idea of nation that is fundamentally different or otherwise than what comes to mind when you read that position in Glissant, right? And I do something similar. I don't want to get too off the question, but I do something similar when I read Paul Gilroy's work, right? Paul Gilroy is very much of the position that any sort of liberatory politics is not something that we can get to if we start from nationists. And so his in place of thinking in terms of nation is to think in terms of diaspora. And so what I do in my reading of Gilroy is similar to what I do in my reading of Glissant. So I can use Glissant for this kind of work, which is to say, well, this critique of nation is no longer nation as this project is thinking about it.
Thanks. I think maybe we'll wrap up there.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a good place to end.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk about your book. I really
No,
enjoyed
the
it.
pleasure was mine. I'm grateful, and I'm grateful to all these people and all these questions, new friends and old friends. Really touched my heart. I appreciate it, especially on Zoom, because I know we're all sick of Zoom.
There you are.
I want to thank you